services, worship, and even to pray in this beautiful church, or to attend, because this is the University Church, the university sermons take place there, or sometimes very important debates. I remember that. Anyway, so it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. William Lamb, and the topic is quite topical as it happens. So Newman, of course, is a absolutely towering figure in the history of Christianity, not only for the Anglican Communion, but also for the Roman Catholic Church, because as you know, he became a Roman Catholic. But apparently, we had this conversation just now, it seems that the process to make him a doctor of the Church, I mean, Roman Catholic Church, but obviously for all Christianity, is well on its way. So we are eager to know more about John Henry Newman, and thank you so much for being here today.
It's a delight and pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Father Luigi, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's wonderful to be with you here today and to have an opportunity to speak about one of my predecessors, John Henry Newman. Occasionally in university towns, people experience what is known as imposter syndrome. They kind of think, am I supposed to be here? Is somebody going to ask me to leave? And I can at least console them by just saying, well, at least you don't have a saint as a predecessor. Now, when John Henry Newman was canonized by Pope Francis at a wonderful celebration at St. Peter's in Rome, it was on the 13th of October 2019. So it's exactly 5 years to the day by a happy accident. His feast day in the Roman Catholic Church is the 9th of October, which is the day of his conversion. It's quite unusual to select such a date as a feast day. Usually, when somebody is canonized and made a saint, their feast day is the day that they're taken up into glory, the day of their death. So in the Church of England, we mark St. John Henry Newman in our calendar on the 11th of August. And I was just asking Father Luigi if he knew when Newman was commemorated in the prayer book in the Episcopal Church, and he couldn't remember. So a bit of homework for you is to find out when Newman's Day is observed in the Episcopal Church. Is it on the 11th of August, or is it possibly, unlikely, the 9th of October? I say unlikely because, of course, some Anglicans might balk at the prospect of marking the feast of St. John Henry Newman on the day that he left the Anglican Communion. All I can say is that it's at least one day in the year when he was both an Anglican and a Catholic. Now, I was part of the official delegation from the Church of England in 2019, and you'll see on your handout a group of Anglicans standing on the steps of St. Peter's, Rome, for the papal mass. And you can see me sort of on the right-hand side in the third row, wearing a choir dress. We rejoiced at Newman's canonization, and many Anglicans, as you can see, participated in the celebrations. The bare outline of Newman's life is well rehearsed. Born in 1801, and you'll see on the other side of the sheet there's a sort of timeline that gives some key dates in his life. Newman was baptized as a member of the Church of England. He went up to Oxford in 1817 and was elected to a fellowship of Oriel College, which is just over the road from St. Mary's Church, in 1822. In 1824, Newman was ordained as a deacon by the Bishop of Oxford, serving his title as the curate of St. Clement's Church. He was ordained priest the following year. So this year, of course, is an important point of celebration for us as Anglicans, because 1824 was the date when his public ministry began. So this year, in 2024, we're celebrating and marking the beginning of his public ministry. But he became the vicar of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in 1828, and he served in that capacity until 1843. During his tenure, Newman became one of the leaders of the Oxford movement. Along with John Keble, Edward Pusey, and others, he sought to animate the Catholic revival of the Church of England. Now, it's probably fair to say that Newman not only enjoyed controversy, he positively revelled in it. But as time continued, as he lost friends and became increasingly isolated, condemned by university authorities and members of the Anglican hierarchy, including his own bishop, he tired of controversy. He resigned as vicar of St. Mary's in 1843 and withdrew to the village of Littlemore, where he had established a quasi-religious community. On the 9th of October 1845, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church. He then went to Rome, where he received further training before being ordained as a Roman Catholic priest in 1847. He returned to England and founded an English oratory in Birmingham. He was then created a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII in 1879 and died on the 11th of August in 1890. He was beatified in Birmingham in 2010 when Pope Benedict XVI visited the United Kingdom. And as I've already said, he was canonized by Pope Francis in 2019. Now, as I've already mentioned, this year is significant because it marks the 200th anniversary of the beginning of Newman's public ministry. Ordained in 1822, there have been a series of events to mark this 200th anniversary in Oxford just recently. And a few days ago, I spent a few days at the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, talking to some of the people who are drafting the positio or submission to the Vatican, petitioning the Pope to make Newman a doctor of the Church. Even before Newman's canonization, there had been many theologians who had wondered about whether Newman might one day be declared a doctor of the Church. Indeed, in 2007, a book was published entitled John Henry Newman, Doctor of the Church, with a foreword by Cardinal Dulles. One reviewer noted that this publication followed an earlier one in which there had been a final essay, John Henry Newman, Doctor of the Church, with a question mark. The reviewer noted that in the later publication, the question mark had been removed. This caused him to remark that the editors were perhaps rather more presumptuous in dropping the question mark. Nevertheless, Cardinal Dulles adopted a rather more judicious tack when he said that the reader will find good reasons for expecting that Newman will someday be numbered with Athanasius and Chrysostom, Augustine and Aquinas among the doctors of the Church. Indeed, in 1990, Father Gregory Winterton, a past provost of the Birmingham Oratory, had expressed the hope that Newman would be beatified, canonized, and made a doctor of the Church. If these words were in any way prescient, we can at least observe that two of these predictions have come true already. But what of the third? The Vatican has various norms and criteria which are used for determining the conferral of the title Doctor of the Church. There are currently 37 Doctors of the Church, and they're people who have made a significant contribution to the doctrine or theology of the Church over the centuries. As well as the ones already mentioned, they include people like Gregory the Great, Ambrose, Jerome, Ephrem the Syrian, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and Therese of Lisieux. In order to be recognized as a doctor of the Church, you need to be a saint, and you need to have a body of opinion willing to support your cause. So the bishops' conferences, that is, the Catholic bishops' conferences in Ireland, Scotland, the United States, and England and Wales have petitioned Pope Francis in recent months. And unusually, they have been joined by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York, who also wrote in fraternal love and charity to join with and support this petition. They noted that the declaration of Newman as a doctor of the Church would be an act of ecumenical fraternity and ecclesial charity. Newman's understanding of the way of faith is a gift to all Christians, Catholics and Anglicans. So why might Anglicans greet Newman's elevation as a doctor of the Church with some generosity and enthusiasm? Why do we continue to hold him in such high regard when, of course, he became such a vigorous critic of Anglican ecclesiology? In 1862, in the face of rumours that Newman might return from Rome to Canterbury, he issued a strongly worded denial. "Protestantism," he said, "is the dreariest of possible religions. The thought of the Anglican service makes me shiver, and the thought of the 39 Articles makes me shudder. Return to the Church of England? No." But of course, this protest arose because many in the Roman hierarchy suspected his Anglican leanings. It provokes an interesting question. How much of Newman's distinctive teaching can be attributed to his Anglican patrimony? I will explore this question briefly with regard to 4 discrete areas: on conscience, on consulting the faithful, on the development of doctrine, and on education, particularly the idea of a university. First, on conscience. Newman's ideas on conscience are well rehearsed. We find references to conscience in Newman's university sermons, in the parochial and plain sermons, in the Grammar of Assent, in the idea of a university, and perhaps most famously in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk. The latter is probably the most polemical of his writings on this subject, for he was responding to the rather intemperate claim by a British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, that Rome requires a convert to forfeit their mental and moral freedom. The context of this is rather interesting. Gladstone, in around 1873, had been attempting to get legislation through Parliament in order to establish a secular foundation as a University of Dublin. Trinity College Dublin had been an Anglican foundation and had existed for some time. And although Catholic students were admitted to Trinity College Dublin, the faculty had to be Anglican. So Gladstone was trying to kind of address these kind of subtle forms of discrimination by reshaping the University of Dublin so that there might be an Anglican college like Trinity College Dublin and a Catholic college as well. The problem was that the Irish bishops, the Catholic bishops in Ireland, were having none of it. They tried to establish their own university in 1847. It hadn't really gone very well because it was short of cash. What the Irish bishops really wanted was for the government to pay for a Catholic University of Ireland, and this is what Gladstone was unwilling to do. So Gladstone was attempting to kind of do this. The legislation failed, and the government fell. So it's impossible to kind of imagine such things in the kind of 21st century. But such were the relations of church and state in the middle of the 19th century that these things had long-lasting effects. So, of course, Gladstone was effectively, by 1874, removed as the Prime Minister, and he went home to his estate in North Wales at Howden Castle, and then had a good sulk. And in sulking, he kind of put all his energies into the publication of this tract in which he made the claim that Rome required a convert to forfeit their moral and mental freedom. Now, Newman responded robustly and he did so in terms of conscience. For Newman, to speak of conscience was to speak of the voice of God in the nature and heart of man. Conscience, he said, was the aboriginal vicar of Christ, and it is in this context that Newman makes the famous remark, "Certainly, if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards." Now, this phrase is often taken as an expression about the freedom of conscience, but I suspect that in summarizing Newman's thought, it is more helpful to emphasize the obligations of conscience. And certainly, after the Second World War in Europe, many Roman Catholic theologians, particularly in Germany, found in Newman a ready conversation partner as they reflected on the significance of conscience and its failings in the context of the Third Reich. We know that a good number of German moral theologians, Roman Catholic theologians, were reading Newman and writing about Newman during this period. And we see the fruit of some of this reflection in Gaudium et Spes at the Second Vatican Council. Many have attributed the prominence of conscience there to the influence of Newman's writings. But here's the thing. That accent on conscience as the voice of God echoes in turn the writing of Bishop Butler, who was a prominent Anglican moral theologian in the 18th century. One of my colleagues, Professor Jane Garnett at Wadham College, Oxford, has pointed out the fascinating echoes of Butler in Newman's thought, particularly when he's writing about conscience. And Newman himself readily acknowledges that debt to Butler later in his life. We know that Newman studied Butler as part of the undergraduate curriculum in Oxford when he was a student there. We know from the library records at Oriel College that he borrowed a collection of Butler's sermons in 1827 and 1829. So thorough has been the research on Newman that people are even checking his library records to find out exactly what he was reading in which year. Late in life, in one of his letters, Newman remarks, "I very much doubt whether my volumes are fit for any but Englishmen. Without, of course, comparing myself with Bishop Butler, I may say that I am of his school, and see what little account he is, how little known on the continent." So this emphasis on conscience betrays some evidence of the influence of the Anglican moral tradition, which is all rather intriguing when you consider the current campaign to have Newman declared as a doctor of the Church. Secondly, on consulting the faithful. One of the remarkable accents of Newman's thought, and I suspect that this is an area which may be more notable in discussions about Newman as a doctor of the Church, is his writing about the sensus fidelium and his reflections on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. Inevitably, Newman was drawing on patristic sources in promoting the idea that the whole people of God, in some respects, are the guarantors and guardians of what the Church believes, sometimes in the face of the distractions and failings of the clergy, particularly the bishops. Now, note the method of approach, but note also it's a characteristically Anglican move in using historical sources from the patristic period. But note also the accent on the role of the laity. The sensus fidelium becomes an expression of what is perceived to be authentic in the life of the Church. Of course, this accent on the sensus fidelium is something that comes to expression at the Second Vatican Council in the Roman Catholic Church, and in a sense is the sort of the kind of antidote, if you like, to the declaration of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1871. It's intriguing that this notion of consulting the faithful of the sensus fidelium is the subject of further exploration in the context of the current exploration of synodality. And in Rome at the moment, Pope Francis is hosting a synod on synodality. That is the idea that the whole people of God should be consulted in matters pertaining to the doctrine and life of the Church. Now, by comparison, there are all sorts of ways in which we can reflect on the role of the laity in the life of the Church of England and the Episcopal Church, not only in terms of synodical government or the workings of General Convention, but also in terms of the role of the parochial church council or vestry in every parish, the lay officers of the church, church wardens and others. But while Anglicans may feel rather self-satisfied about the full inclusion of the laity in the synodical structures of the church, there are also perhaps some weaknesses. For example, the standing orders of the General Synod of the Church of England are modelled on parliamentary procedure. And while we may regret this, there is some inevitability about it, in that General Synod is a legislative body. As the established church, when a measure is approved by Synod, it then receives parliamentary consent. It has the same status as an Act of Parliament. So the process needs to be robust, but something has been lost in the process. How might Newman help us to reflect on a pattern of synodality that owed less to the British parliamentary system and more to the kind of discernment that a true pattern of synodality requires? So some of us are watching the current synod in Rome with interest. Now, thirdly, Newman's writings on the development of doctrine constitute, I think, his most significant contribution as a theologian. I say this partly because we underestimate the significance of the way in which Newman took the claims of historical research and historical scholarship seriously in thinking about theology. Again, these writings make no sense without understanding the deep and abiding interest in patristics, which was characteristic of Anglican theology in the course of the 19th century. In Newman's more academic writings, we can see in outline his recognition of the significance of historical method in shaping theological judgments. Now, we don't really kind of think of this as remarkable at all. We've kind of learned how to be kind of historians in terms of our education. We know the importance of kind of context and reading historic documents in context. Next year, in 2025, we'll be celebrating an important anniversary which relates to the Nicene Creed that we say Sunday by Sunday, because of course that creed dates in part from the Council of Nicaea in 325. But of course, as soon as you begin to study the historic documents relating to the Nicene Creed, you begin to realize that over a period of centuries, as the Church had to negotiate responses to a variety of different doctrinal controversies, suddenly words get added and kind of things change. And this is the thing that Newman noticed, not specifically about the Nicene Creed, but about the way in which doctrine develops in the life of the Church. It's doctrine that is informed by an historical consciousness. So, and this was a kind of massive change, I think, in the life of the Church, because people sort of tended to see particularly the creeds, as something that had kind of just sort of dropped out of heaven, kind of right at the beginning of the Church's life at Pentecost. You know the story about the Apostles' Creed? There are 12 articles, and each of the apostles kind of goes round, kind of in a circle in the upper room, kind of saying each article of the Creed. I mean, that's the kind of story that is told about the Apostles' Creed. But of course, we know that the creeds developed over a period of centuries. Now, we can see the development of Newman's own thought in a university sermon preached at St. Mary's in 1843 on the Feast of Candlemas, when Newman meditates on Luke's words after the story of the presentation of Christ in the temple, where it says, Mary pondered all these things in her heart. Newman reflects on this phrase in order to argue that reason plays an active role in exploring the mystery of faith. Divine revelation does not dispense with our capacity to understand. And as Newman's own thought develops, he recognizes that the development of doctrine lies in an intensification of our capacity to understand the mystery of what has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ. So when Newman is talking about the development of doctrine, he's not simply talking about a process by which the doctrine of the church is made up. He's talking about the way in which the church reflects ever more deeply on the mystery which has been revealed in Jesus Christ, to discover the fullness of the truth of that mystery. Now, of course, in the Anglican Communion, these insights about the development of doctrine have also enabled us to recognize and embrace a number of key developments in theology and ecclesiology. While Newman might himself have eschewed some of the developments which Episcopalians and Anglicans have embraced, it's difficult to imagine these ecclesiological developments happening without Newman's reflections about the development of doctrine. While Newman may have had some trenchant criticisms of Anglican ecclesiology, his thinking around development has perhaps influenced the idea of receptive ecumenism, which has become very popular in discussions between Anglicans and Roman Catholics particularly. And what receptive ecumenism is about is that it creates potential for much richer ecumenical engagement. Instead of asking what other church traditions need to learn from us, we ask what our tradition needs to learn from them, what we can receive, which is of God. What part of the mystery of Christ have we missed that others have seen? That perspective only makes sense in recognizing that doctrine develops in response to the gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, finally, education, more particularly higher education. Described as one of the most quoted but least read books in English literature, Newman's idea of a university brought to expression the most original and extended account of the purpose of a liberal education in the course of the 19th century. He wrote it when he was the rector of the fledgling Catholic University of Ireland. The book is significant for helping Anglicans and Roman Catholics to talk about the formation of character and the place of faith in that process, in an educational context increasingly today at the mercy of a more utilitarian, functional, and secularizing ideology. It means that Newman has something to contribute to that vital public conversation about the purpose of higher education. And that affects all of us, regardless of our denominational affiliation or our ecumenical attachments. But what intrigues me most about his writings on higher education is the way in which they continue to bear influence on wider and more secular debates. Newman is a key conversation partner for anyone writing about higher education. And that makes me think that a doctor of the church is someone who speaks not only to the church, but also to the wider culture. Just as it would be unthinkable to write about the history of Western philosophy without including the likes of Thomas Aquinas, so it is almost impossible to write about a liberal education without thinking about St. John Henry Newman. Now, Anthony Kenny, a former master of Balliol College in Oxford, once observed that John Henry Newman was a man who spent the first half of his life trying to persuade the Church of England to be more like the Church of Rome, and the second half of his life wishing that Roman Catholics were more like Anglicans. But is that judgment fair? Are the issues which led to Newman's departure from the Church of England still on the table? Have those issues changed? Have other issues arisen? All questions which I hope may provoke a lively conversation in the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, incidentally, I did the opposite
You did?
Kind of way, because I went from Roman Catholic Church to the Anglican Church. But Newman has been an immensely influential figure in my journey. I remember, the Apologia was really one of those things that marked me for life. So thank you very much. Gave me much. I thought I knew a lot about Newman, but actually this gave me so much food for thought. So we have time for a few questions. Please feel free if there's anything you would like to deepen. Figure, Newman.
Yes, please.
In the Catholic Church, the things that I read about church, there's a tremendous reaction to the idea of synodality in the church council.
Yeah.
So what do you attribute that from your point of view?
I think,
Just repeat the question.
of course. So our colleague has observed that in the Roman Catholic Church at the moment, there is a tremendous reaction against synodality. To what might one attribute that? I think it's a really interesting question, and it comes into focus around the legacy of John Henry Newman. Because one of the things that I have observed in contemporary Roman Catholic thought is that one is often confronted with two versions of John Henry Newman. One is the sort of the passionate convert who becomes a kind of Roman Catholic and disowns his Anglican inheritance of faith. In a sense, certainly kind of when Newman was canonized in 2019, I found myself at St. Mary's kind of hosting events for these kind of two different groups. Those that kind of, wanted to sort of hold on to the idea that Newman was quite a conservative and a reactionary figure, and those on the other hand, who saw in Newman's accent on the development of doctrine, on a historical context, on a historical consciousness, somebody who was much more kind of sympathetic to aspects of the agenda of the Second Vatican Council. So I think there have always been the sort of conservative and more kind of progressive strands within the Roman Catholic Church. I'm conscious that they're kind of particularly pronounced here in the United States, much more so than they are in Europe. But that kind of relates, for example, to questions about the development of doctrine. There are also some interesting tensions around conscience. When I was talking about Newman's sort of influence in Europe, particularly after the Second World War, German theologians were kind of saying, look, Catholics have kind of participated in the atrocities of the Third Reich. What has gone wrong in terms of cultivating and fashioning the conscience of our people so that they wouldn't do this sort of thing? And so what those moral theologians were interested in was the kind of the obligations of conscience. Conscience as something that kind of leads to remorse. Conscience as that sort of little voice on your shoulder kind of saying you really shouldn't be doing that. And that is kind of one version of conscience. But of course, in the United States, particularly in the same period at the Second Vatican Council, where there are kind of two things in play. One is the Vietnam War and conscientious objection to being signed up for the Vietnam War. And secondly, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, the legacy of Humanae Vitae, which was the Pope's teaching on birth control. And suddenly, conscience becomes quite a significant feature of that debate, particularly thinking in terms of freedom of conscience. So between your sort of conservatives and liberals, you've got one group sort of emphasizing the obligations of conscience and another group emphasizing freedom of conscience. And that means that Newman's legacy is heavily contested in some respects. Really interesting question, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
You said that Newman reacted against the 39 articles in the Church of England. What did he find more attractive in if that was constraining, what did he find more attractive in the Roman Church?
Now, that's a complicated question. So, in around, I think it was 1843, he published a tract. One of the things that members of the Oxford movement were sometimes known as was tractarians, because they produced these tracts for the Times. And in 1843, Newman published Tract 90, which was on the 39 Articles of Religion. Now, if you study the 39 Articles of Religion, these important historic documents in the formation of Anglicanism, and you'll find them as historic documents in the back of the 1979 prayer book. In Newman's time, any sort of clergy person in the Church of England, at the point that they were ordained or at the point at which they took on a particular office, had to subscribe to the 39 Articles of Religion. So these were kind of associated with a kind of the identity of Anglicanism. And what Newman does is that he kind of reinterprets the 39 Articles of Religion in the light of his understanding of the via media, the middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism, to kind of interpret them in a much more kind of Catholic direction. And the controversy that that provokes, because he's kind of saying, you know, these texts are not Calvinist at all. You know, there's no hint of Calvinism here at all. For the many Calvinists in the Church of England, including the ones on the bishop's bench at the time, this was just too much to bear. So for a variety of reasons, Newman's teaching is kind of condemned, and immediately you can begin to see how he becomes estranged from the hierarchy, and this kind of provokes a pattern of doubt that causes him to sort of question the status of the Church of England as he had understood it, and that drives him, I think, in a much more sort of Romeward direction. Is that helpful? Thank you.
What were some aspects of the Church of England service that Newman felt was missing as opposed to a Catholic service? And what specific elements and why was that so important to him?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult for us to sort of imagine this now, partly because the liturgical changes that have taken place over the last 100 years within the Episcopal Church and within the Church of England have been significant. And those changes have taken place in the light of liturgical reforms. So in the Church of England, the introduction of common worship, in the Episcopal Church, the introduction of the 1979 prayer book. And those changes took place because liturgical scholars on our behalf were revisiting some of the most ancient liturgical texts, as were Roman Catholic liturgists at the time. And because both of us were sort of revisiting these more ancient texts, we began to kind of recognize our sort of common inheritance. So now, for example, the standard pattern of worship in the Episcopal Church and in the Church of England is much more Eucharistic in its focus. The Eucharist is, in most parishes, the main or principal Sunday morning service. Now, in Newman's time, that was not the case. And one of the ways in which I like to sort of explain this sometimes is that for people who are kind of visiting the University Church, and if you've never visited the University Church in Oxford, then just add it to your bucket list, because we'd love to see you there. But if you look at the church, you will see it kind of replicate the shape of the nave and the chancel and sanctuary in St. Thomas's Church, with the high altar kind of at the far end, and the kind of seating in the nave. But if you look at pictures of St. Mary's in the 19th century, you will see that the screen that splits the chancel from the nave was are at that time almost completely blocked off. There are 3 arches through which you can see the high altar at the moment, but 2 of those arches were completely blocked. And there were big galleries that went all the way around the nave at St Mary's, which means that rather than just having kind of seating sort of pointing towards the high altar, as we do now, there was seating that was ranged all around, and it pointed not towards the altar, but towards the pulpit. Because the pulpit, the sermon, was the kind of principal means in which people learned about the faith. So the main Sunday morning service was either matins, or in the university church it could be the litany plus a university sermon. The litany was distinguished at St Mary's because it was in Latin, as was sometimes the celebration of Holy Communion. Indeed, we still have communion in Latin, a version of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which was translated into Latin in 1670, because we maintain the fiction in the University of Oxford that Latin is still the official language of the University of Oxford. So, of course, if you revisit the 39 Articles of Religion that talk about the liturgy being in a language that is understood by the people, then the argument went that we could have the Book of Common Prayer in Latin. So we still do, bizarrely. But, of course, what that sort of underlines is that the kind of the pattern and style of worship in the 19th century was very different from what it was today. Even hymnody, you know, that is, I mean, has been through a kind of huge change over the last 150 years or so.
So if he was alive now, maybe he could have
I think if he came to St Thomas's on a Sunday morning, he would be blown away. Yep.
We might have time for a very, very, very short question. In this case, since Max calls us, we can warmly thank Father for the visit. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.